What we're going to talk about here today is EKS Anywhere, which is our on-premises distribution of AWS EKS distro. EKS distro is what EKS in the cloud and EKS Anywhere on-premises are based on. We're going to dive into that more, but first and foremost, what are the use cases for EKS Anywhere on-premises? Why would customers want to run Kubernetes on-premises? Of course, for supporting low latency applications, so in finance, manufacturing, where we have physical machines that, of course, can't leave a manufacturing floor, or if they're trying to modernize into, taking some legacy Java applications, for example, and containerizing those and putting them into Kubernetes, or if there are local data residency requirements, such as a lot of states, a lot of countries have real money gaming requirements where compute data can't leave the country. EKS Anywhere can kind of solve for those. Disconnected specific workloads. So if you have, for example, a power and energy type customer where you have to be able to disconnect from an environment, EKS Anywhere can run fully disconnected, never has to call home for anything. Disaster recovery, if you're running on premises and want to be able to disaster recovery into EKS in the cloud is another good scenario. And then telco and data locally, I already kind of mentioned data residency, but also if you have a lot of data that you're trying to process locally. For example, we work with a lot of autonomous vehicle customers that are running some of their data processing on premises. And then back to telco, every 5G workload runs on a little tiny data center at the bottom of that tower. So these are good use cases, again, for running EKS Anywhere in the field. So I mentioned a few of the segments that we work with, manufacturing and telco being kind of big ones. Manufacturing right now, for example, I'm working with a customer that is deploying EKS Anywhere on premises to over 300 of their manufacturing plants. So they're going to run workload clusters at each of those environments. Financial services, we actually have a use case out there right now for the largest bank in Israel that is using EKS Anywhere. Telco customers, I kind of covered a little bit, but really for those 5G edge workloads, customers using EKS Anywhere for those sorts of things. And then healthcare, working with another customer right now that is using EKS Anywhere to distribute software to hospitals. I'm an ex-hotels guy, and I always want to say hotels there, but so deploying their software to hospitals around the country and around the world. And then I mentioned real money gaming is one use case, but also digital gaming. For Amazon, for AWS, we have regions that are around. We have local zones that get closer to users when it comes to doing compute. And then if you need to get even closer, that's where, again, EKS Anywhere can run in an on-premises environment to support gaming customers. So why EKS Anywhere? So the proposition here is the consistent, reliable. I mentioned that Amazon EKS and Amazon EKS Anywhere on premises are both based on EKS distro, which is our packaged, hardened, tested distribution of Kubernetes. So the same lineage that you get there for testing, hardening, security patches, release cycle, all of that is inherited in both EKS Anywhere and EKS in the cloud. Simplified Kubernetes management. So what EKS Anywhere kind of brings to the table there is that it automates the deployment of workload clusters. If you've seen any talks about Cluster API or have learned anything about Cluster API, that's what EKS Anywhere is based on. We create a management cluster that can create workload clusters. It's clusters creating clusters. It's turtles all the way down. And then we also have what are called AWS curated packages. In almost every Kubernetes environment, there's things that you have to bolt onto a cluster, like load balancing, ingress, those sorts of things. So we provide AWS curated packages, which are packages of existing open source components like Emissary for ingress, Metal LB for load balancing, and then we package those as curated packages, which are fully supported, tested, and hardened by us through AWS, right? So those are included with the product there. And then if EKS Anywhere, first and foremost, is free and open source. Everybody and anybody can run EKS Anywhere on premises without ever having to call or contact AWS ever. However, if you are in an enterprise environment and need or want enterprise support, that is what we charge for ultimately, right? That is what you can actually pay a subscription for, at which point if you are an AWS customer, that's all included in your enterprise support. And then a lot of customers right now that I'm talking with are, they've got a lot of down payments to make still on hardware that they have, and they want to leverage that. So they're looking at using EKS Anywhere in those environments as well. So I mentioned the kind of consistent and reliable state here for, for EKS Anywhere. So the offline environment versus EKS in the cloud, right? So here on this side, we have EKS Anywhere on premises, and over here we have EKS in AWS. And you can see that a lot of the same things are there, right? So provisioning, Node OS, the CNI support, Flux for GitOps, those things are supported on both sides, but in different ways, right? So in AWS, right, we have most of that automated for you with ALBs and NLBs for load balancing, for example. But in an on-premises environment, we don't have ALBs and NLBs, so we provide Metal LB as a curated package for load balancing. But all of these things we've kind of established the same level of support, but with different tools because on-premises has different availability of things, right? So, and then EKS distro, as I mentioned, both of these, EKS in the cloud, our fully managed Kubernetes service, and EKS Anywhere, which is a customer-managed EKS or Kubernetes service, are all based on EKS distro, which is itself, of course, based on vanilla Kubernetes. And then the integrations that I touched on a little bit for curated packages. So in kind of starting from the left here with what we have for the operating system and the CNI. So EKS Anywhere takes full control of managing the nodes that run on the cluster. So for example, in VMware, we actually will create VMs, put the disk image down on them. In bare metal, we'll actually DHCP PXE boot a machine and paint an operating system onto the disk to bring it into a cluster. So in all of those cases, we support Bottle Rocket, which is our containerized container support operating system. So if you're familiar with like Flatcar or the old CoreOS, it's a stripped down, totally flattened environment that is really only for running containers. Security teams love Bottle Rocket because it has basically no attack surface. It only runs containers. That's the only thing it can do. But we also support Ubuntu and Red Hat if customers have a Red Hat requirement, or if they need to make a lot of really heavy customization, then Ubuntu and Red Hat are for that. And then the CNI, our friends at Isovalent help us support Cilium as the default. Of course, every Kubernetes environment, every Kubernetes cluster you build has to have a CNI installed. So in EKS Anywhere, we provide Cilium by default, but customers, again, can swap that out for another CNI or Cilium Enterprise if they'd like. Those can be swapped out. And then for GitOps and for creating clusters, we have GitOps and EKS CLI support. So if you're just spinning up a cluster yourself manually, or you're doing it for the very first time, you kind of start with the CLI. But then as we scale out into like a production setup, a production environment, we usually help customers work towards GitOps. I mentioned Metal LB, Emissary as ingress and load balance support, but we also support Cluster Autoscaler, Prometheus, Metric Server, these things. So now, importantly, I mentioned that EKS Anywhere has no requirement to ever talk to AWS, but you'll see here that there's some lines here, right? So these are potential integrations that customers can build. So if you want to hook up Cert Manager to Certificate Manager in AWS, or AWS distro for open telemetry, if you want to push metrics into AWS managed Prometheus, these are integrations you can build. So the manufacturing customer I mentioned before with 300 manufacturing plants all running Kubernetes clusters on premises, their data or their metrics and monitoring will all go through AWS distro for open telemetry and then be pushed up into AWS, where they can now see kind of around the world the state of their environments. And then over here is kind of a list of things that we're considering working on as we gather more feedback from customers, storage and logging, some of the other kind of potential integrations there. So what are the infrastructure options? I did mention that EKS Anywhere runs on a couple of things. I mentioned bare metal and VMware, but so tying this back into this, so virtualized environments here, we support two things. We support VMware and Apache Cloud Stack. Cloud Stack booth is right over back that way, I think. So if you're running vSphere on premises or running Apache Cloud Stack on premises, or customers that I've talked to recently, have very large machines that they're worried about not being able to kind of max out running Kubernetes and bare metal. So they're looking at installing Cloud Stack so they can actually kind of dice up the machines a little bit. And then in non-virtualized environments, we support bare metal. And this is an unfortunate thing. I was supposed to bring a Snowball Edge with me to this trip, but it didn't get here. So the Snowball Edge device, if you're not familiar, is a edge compute and storage device that is hardened to be able to like throw in the back of a truck. Customers use it for data migration, for example. Load 80 terabytes of data onto it, chuck it into a UPS truck or DHL maybe out here, I guess, and ship it off to AWS to load data. But alternatively, there is a compute-optimized Snowball Edge. So you can actually ship 3 of these out to a location and run Kubernetes, run EKS Anywhere on the Snowball compute device. And then hyper-converged infrastructure. There's only one box there, and I bet everybody could figure out what was going to pop up there. So we also work with Nutanix. EKS Anywhere is supported on Nutanix as well. And then for testing, and we really like to make this clear, that for testing and just kind of playing around with understanding the product, we do also support running effectively in Docker through like Kind. And I mentioned the Bottle Rocket. All of these things are GA right now. And I mentioned Bottle Rocket as kind of the first class operating system, but we also support Ubuntu and RHEL. And then in the fully connected mode that I hinted at before, so if customers want to, there's a integration you can install called EKS Connector, which basically just runs as like any other pod or controller in your cluster and can push information about your cluster up to the EKS control plane. So if you're running EKS in the cloud, EKS Anywhere on premises, you can kind of see all of them in one place. EKS Connector, however, currently is more or less a read-only thing. You only see what's running in the cluster. You can't modify the cluster through that mechanism. And then we support IAM roles for service accounts, very tiny little font right here, that says if you, so for example, are trying to push metrics from on-premises to Amazon Managed Prometheus, you need an IAM role that can do that. So this URSA basically applies IAM roles for a service account in Kubernetes, so it has those permissions. And then we also pull images from ECR and S3 when we're building the cluster environment. But in a fully disconnected mode, where a customer isn't going to be pushing any data to AWS or integrating with AWS, obviously we don't have any of those things, and we no longer will pull the images from the cloud, we'll pull them from your on-premises container registry. So if you're running Artifactory or any of those sorts of things, we can pull the images that we need to build clusters from there instead of the internet. And then the shared support model I mentioned, AWS, EKS in the cloud on AWS is a fully managed solution for from Amazon, from AWS. And then EKS Anywhere becomes the customer managed solution, right? Because you are running a full Kubernetes cluster on premises, etcd and all. So on the customer's responsibility side is your applications, your code, the operations, managing your load balancers, and any sort of third-party tooling, where a lot of those things we're going to manage for you in EKS on the cloud. And then Kasten, our friends here, are a launch partner for EKS Anywhere. That if you've hung out for any of their demos, can do migrations between clusters. So the kind of demonstration here is EKS Anywhere on premises to EKS in the cloud. And I'm told there's an embedded video that is going to play when I click this
Welcome
button.
to this demo of protecting and migrating applications on Amazon EKS. We'll start in the Kasten K10 multi-cluster dashboard, where we have 2 clusters connected, EKS Anywhere on-prem and EKS in US East 2 for production. Here in the Kasten K10 dashboard, we'll start looking at our main screen and the applications that we have installed within our EKS Anywhere dev cluster. Our corporate website runs on our EKS dev cluster today, and it contains multiple pods with persistent volume claims. Switching over to our US East production cluster, you can see that no applications exist yet in this cluster. We're going to take a look at the K10 global resources and show that we have a global policy for data protection using Amazon AWS S3. Let's create our first global policy for the protection of our website application. Here in the Kasten K10 UI, we'll give the policy a name, select the snapshot frequency, and enable exports out to our AWS S3 location. We can select applications by name, or labels. We'll select all of our policies and click Create Policy. Let's run this policy one time over in our EKS Anywhere dev cluster. This will protect our corporate website application. As you can see here in the Kasten K10 UI, we can follow the Actions window and the status of our data protection policy. Kasten K10 will run a snapshot and then export the application back up to AWS S3. Here's a look at our application running in our dev test Amazon EKS Anywhere cluster. We're ready to migrate this application into production, and we can use Kasten K10. Let's export this application so that we can now import it then into the EKS production cluster out on the US East 2 region. Let's create our first export policy, copy the encryption key, and we can watch the progress of the export here in the action window of Kasten K10. Once our export is complete, we'll switch over to our US East 2 production cluster and create a temporary import policy for this application. Give this import policy a name, choose Restore after import, and the power of Kasten K10 allows us to dynamically change the characteristics of an application on import. For this application, we will need to change the storage class because the storage class on-prem is different than what's in our Amazon cluster in the public cloud. Once we apply those transformations to the import policy, let's paste in our encryption key, select our S3 target, and click Create Policy. Once our policy is created, let's run this policy once. This will start the import and migration of the application from EKS Anywhere into EKS Public Cloud. Here in the Actions window, we can watch the progress of the import. Once our import is complete, you can now see the application dynamically show up in the Kasten K10 UI. Our application import is complete. Now that our application has been migrated to production, let's delete it off of our dev test cluster. Let's use our kubectl command to delete our namespace for the corporate website. Once the corporate website namespace is deleted, you can see it removed from the Kasten K10 UI. This application now only exists in production on the US East 2 cluster. And let's validate that our application is now running in this new cluster. And here's our website completely running now in our production cluster. The migration was easy and simple with Kasten K10.
And that is the extent of the video demo there. Again, I'm Ray Kruger with AWS. My email address is there if anybody wants to contact me, but it looks like we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes for any questions. If not, I'll be either here or at the AWS booth. Thank you very much.
Ray, thank you so much for your time here today. Nice presentation. Any questions for Ray on the solution he's shown or anything, any part of the demo? Anyone have a question? All right. If not, we'll proceed directly. And Ray, if you would help me here with the drawing.